What you want is a cohesive plan to shore up all of the national security challenges that you are facing. What you are getting are a whole bunch of self-contradictions. Yes, every handful of years, the United States releases a document known as the National Security Strategy. It is a public explanation of Washington's priorities on the international stage, and how policymakers from the State Department and the Pentagon plan to achieve those goals. Well, as you may have heard, this year's national security strategy was especially spicy. Plans change from administration to administration, of course, so it is not surprising to see Trump take a fundamentally different stance than Biden. But Trump is now taking a fundamentally different stance than Trump. That is, Trump circa 2017, the last time he was responsible for releasing one of these documents. As for the substance, and as is tradition in the partisan world that we live in, the 2025 National Security Strategy misrepresents some critical aspects of U.S. foreign policy, while critiques of Trump's plan also misstate what the goals are here, because there are some important and justified parts of the strategy. And you know full well that there is going to be an assortment of misunderstandings of how international relations works, which will frustrate my boring old academic self. So today, we are going to go through the full document, all 33 pages of it, which I will link to in the description. It is a fast read that you could probably finish over lunch, so I recommend doing that. But if you just want to listen to me as you wash your dishes, I will cover all of the important things that you need to know, including the aforementioned inherent contradictions. The public document consists of 3 de facto sections. It starts with the foreword by President Trump. For reasons unclear, this part appears to have been copied and pasted as an image into the PDF, leading to the blurry page that you are now seeing on your screen. Do not blame me for that. Then the main document has 4 sections. But really, the first 14 pages are an overview of the national security strategy, while the remaining 15 pages detail particular strategies for various world regions. And so rather than go in a specific order, I am going to hop around a bit to give you the 10 most important broader takeaway points from it. Point number 1. National security strategies are worth listening to. It is very easy to fall for the trap that we should not listen to what leaders say, but rather watch what they do. A national security strategy is a document that says a whole bunch of stuff, and therefore we should dismiss it as cheap talk fluff, according to this argument. Well, a couple of points on that. 1. National security strategies outline the governing principles of the administration's foreign policy. It is a foundational document that both bureaucrats and civil servants within the State Department and the Pentagon look to in how to formulate U.S. positions abroad. Consequently, it is more of a condensed explanation of what is happening than a series of ambiguous threats that may or may not be bluffs. Of course, there will be elements of cheap talk threats woven into any document like this. Quote, "The United States will reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere." Or, "We will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities, or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere." These may or may not be credible threats in practice, but passages like these are not the entirety of the document. Second, even aside from setting the agenda, this document lays out a hierarchy of what is important versus what is not. Verbal threats in international relations tend to be meaningless because, if believed, they would coerce opponents into offering greater concessions, like not taking a step into the Western Hemisphere. There is pure upside to bluffing, no downside. But if a leader says that he wants something more than something else, then now we have a hierarchy of preferences. This causes opponents in one arena to take the threats more seriously, and opponents in another arena to take threats less seriously. Thus, there is an actual trade-off for the leader, and in turn, we can learn some credible new information. Actually, the document makes this point for me in its introduction to the regional priorities. It specifically criticizes previous national security strategies as not being focused enough, and that the United States needs to place more emphasis on regions that have greater geopolitical importance. Point number 2. The 2025 National Security Strategy is a partisan document. It is hard for national security strategies to be completely devoid of partisanship, especially as the foreign policy divide between Republicans and Democrats widens over time. However, the tone of national security strategies tends to be bureaucratic, professional, and somewhat academic. Actually, sometimes they are written by academics, but please do not look at me come 2029. This year's document is a departure from that norm, though, even compared to Trump's 2017 national security strategy. Just look at the first page of 2025's, a foreword written by Trump. Quote, "Over the past 9 months, we have brought our nation, and the world, back from the brink of catastrophe and disaster. After 4 years of weakness, extremism, and deadly failures, my administration has moved with urgency and historic speed to restore American strength at home and abroad, and bring peace and stability to our world. No administration has achieved so dramatic a turnaround in so short a time." Later, the foreword describes Trump's successes in stopping Iran's nuclear program, which, to be clear, the intelligence community is still not sure about one way or another. It also goes over the 8 wars that Trump claims that he has mediated the end to, though disputants like India raise questions of how much Trump contributed to those efforts. It also does not help that Thailand launched some airstrikes on Cambodia shortly after the national security strategy was released. On the other hand, cases like Armenia and Azerbaijan are a little more cut and dry. But it is not just Trump's foreword that is like that. The first formal section discusses how American strategy went astray, and how Trump made a necessary, welcome correction. The traditionally dull policy document also now has references to DEI, in scare quotes, and climate change, also in scare quotes, the latter of which presents an interesting juxtaposition to Trump's fascination with Greenland, which is becoming more valuable only because the ice in the north is melting. Other parts seem to focus more on American domestic policy, with relatively loose connections to foreign policy, such as growing numbers of strong, traditional families that raise healthy children. Heck, the culture wars framing even extends to the section on Europe, where the document warns of civilizational erasure on the continent. Personally, I do not find these parts of the document to be very interesting, as they are rehashes of what you can get from cable news right now if you really wanted to. So I'm going to stick to the more substantive points on the national security strategy, with one last note about its construction. Point number 3. It lacks a coherent narrative. In the past, we have discussed at length how America First means a bunch of things to a bunch of different people, and those interpretations are often at direct odds with one another. For example, America First means that the United States will adopt an isolationist approach to world affairs. But also, America First means that the United States can do whatever it wants because it is so powerful, which includes attacking whichever countries do not align with its foreign policy. We have been watching these types of competing visions fight in real time over the past few months, and we are observing these types of internal contradictions inside of the 2025 National Security Strategy as well. Here on page 9, we have a general principle of the strategy as a predisposition to non-interventionism. It will not surprise you that when we are discussing the regional strategies, that there will be quite a bit of interventionism proposed. Meanwhile, one of the biggest initiatives that the Trump administration took at the beginning of the year was to slash USAID spending. But in the back half of the document, it laments how America and its allies have not yet formulated, much less executed, a joint plan for the so-called Global South. This is important because China and Russia have stepped into this position, and are winning friends and allies as a consequence. But answering that means giving aid. There is a certain sense of irony here. USAID was created as a means of winning the Cold War, but in the shadow of a second Cold War beginning, the Trump administration cut 83% of USAID programs. Point number 4. The Monroe Doctrine returns. I mentioned earlier that national security strategies are revealing by prioritizing some issue areas over others. Well, here is a big one. The Western Hemisphere is the first region discussed. The top line for the section is that the United States will not tolerate foreign powers from outside of the Americas having political influence in the region. The priority level here is in stark contrast to Trump's 2017 national security strategy, which had the Western Hemisphere buried under the Indo-Pacific, Europe, the Middle East, and South and Central Asia. It is hard to read this as anything other than Secretary of State / Acting National Security Advisor Marco Rubio having substantial sway in the White House. A pivot to the Western Hemisphere was not on the average American's mind coming into the Trump presidency, but it is most certainly something that Rubio has great interest in. Half of this is Venezuela. The signs are further compounding that something is happening there. Rubio did not go to the Foreign Minister Summit at NATO last week. Remember that Rubio is the point man on Venezuela, so this would make sense if something could have possibly happened last week, or something is in the works in the near future. The United States has also been increasing troop and equipment deployments in Puerto Rico in recent days. Again, none of that necessarily means that a war is going to occur here, but it does tell us that the United States is prepared to do something if Venezuela does not politically resolve the substantive problems. Point number 5. Enforcing the Monroe Doctrine. The problem with the doctrine is that you actually have to be credibly prepared to enforce it if you want it to have any meaningful effect on policy. And that creates some inherent contradictions within the national security strategy. The document is critical of forever wars that the United States has fought in the past. They are a broad drain on U.S. finances and coercive capabilities. Okay, that is fine. There are not very many people in the United States that would look at what happened in Afghanistan or Iraq and not think that serious mistakes were made in those conflicts. But enforcing the Monroe Doctrine means getting involved in the domestic politics of other American countries, a policy liable to create conditions for civil wars. And it turns out that civil wars last a long time, easily over a decade on average. In other words, enforcing the Monroe Doctrine means getting involved in the forever wars that this national security strategy objects to. There is further irony here. Again, it is not like Afghanistan or Iraq were fantastic conflicts for the United States, but the amount of damage that either of those forever wars did to the United States was relatively minimal. Outside of a few months in 2001 and 2003, your average American could have been completely oblivious to the existence of those wars, and their costs could be absorbed into the larger U.S. budget without resulting in serious domestic sacrifices. It is the joy of being the richest country on the planet, and it also stands in nice contrast to what Russia is currently experiencing. Where the forever wars caused problems was more in the overall vision of U.S. national security from Washington's perspective. Focusing on how to conduct counterinsurgency campaigns left the United States ill-prepared to deal with the return of interstate conflict. But again, that was a vision problem, not a resource problem, and it provides us with a great transition to the next topic. Point number 6. The Indo-Pacific Pivot. Despite the Western Hemisphere receiving the top billing, Asia gets the most attention in terms of page numbers. Part of that is probably because the Pentagon has worked on this for much longer, so this section feels more coherent than the bit about the Americas. It is also a more strategically complicated region, so you would need to write more about it regardless of your priorities. Setting aside why this section is longer, it begins with a misunderstanding of the grand strategy of trade policy with China, claiming that there have been, quote, 3 decades of mistaken American assumptions about China, namely that by opening our markets to China, we would facilitate China's entry into the so-called rules-based international order. This would then allow the West to peacefully coexist with China as a superpower. And look, there is still a pathway by which that happens. Trade with China has created a large and growing middle class. Historically speaking, over time, middle classes use their wealth to demand greater political power. That would mean democratic reforms inside of China. From there, you hope that a democratic China also follows the historical trend of democratic states playing nice with one another. Again, all of that is possible. But those are second-order effects of trade. They are not the main goal. Instead, the main goal is to make war directly more expensive by raising the opportunity cost to fight. If China has invested so much in creating trade relations with the West, then fighting a war to disrupt the status quo would mean sacrificing all of those benefits. Thus, China ought to be more inclined to preserve the status quo with trade than without. I could show you the lines of increased economic interdependence, but the idea is straightforward enough without the additional visual. Yes, economic interdependence does not have a perfect track record. Look no further than Europe trying to persuade Russia to move past its imperial legacy, and promptly failing. Professionally, one of the sub-themes of my textbook on why wars occur is all of the various different ways that raising the potential costs of war can lead to an increase in the frequency of wars. But those are the exceptions, not the rule. And at least so far, contrary to the point that the national security strategy raises, that part of the grand strategy has worked quite well. Where the national security strategy is on better footing is with all of the issues that can arise with trade practices. Something like China controlling parts of the weapons supply chain certainly qualifies. Same with operating outside of Western intellectual property laws, or the outright production of illegal goods. These concerns have large bipartisan support, so this is where the Trump administration's plan could make serious headway. Point number 7. Prioritizing China over Europe. It is tempting for frustrated Europeans to look at the Trump administration, conclude that all is lost for the next 3 years, and look instead for a path forward to 2029. That would be a mistake. The prioritization of China over Europe is not a Trump-specific phenomenon. It was also present in Biden's national security strategy, written after the invasion of Ukraine began, and presidents had raised similar points going even further back. Whoever takes office in 2029 will only find themselves further down the Indo-Pacific rabbit hole. All of this is to say that it is in Europe's best interest to listen to what is being articulated in the national security strategy, and be serious about investing in its own continental defense. Because, Trump or otherwise, that will be a critical part of the Western security apparatus moving forward. Much has been made of the national security strategy not labeling Russia as a threat to the United States. The logic here is that the White House really wants to underscore that Russia is a problem for Europe to deal with. But contrary to some internet chatter, this is not some sort of conspiratorial situation where the United States has aligned with Russia. Again, a huge chunk of the document is geared toward getting Europe to spend more on defense, which is something that directly hurts Russia. And going back to the whole Monroe Doctrine thing, Russia and China have been the only two countries making moves there. That said, this is another place where the national security strategy contains a self-contradiction. It stresses the importance of U.S. soft power in international affairs. The Trump administration has prodded Europe non-stop for the last 9 months. Not having even a paragraph or two discussing the United States' role in building Europe's defense along the eastern flank only serves to erode what remains of U.S. soft power in the region. Point number 8. European trade. Perhaps a more encouraging sign for Europe comes in the form of how the United States views trade policy in the document. Because goodness how this has been a turbulent relationship. Tariffs abound, the conflation of trade deficits being inherently bad rather than a reflection of how the United States is rich and therefore wants to buy a lot of stuff, you name it. But if all Trump tries to do is maximize wealth creation, then this section about how transatlantic trade remaining as one of the pillars of the global economy and of American prosperity is good news. If Europe ceases to be functional, then there goes the entire plan for the United States. Of course, I'm connecting that to NATO's Article 5 commitment. You have probably heard from me enough times about how European policymakers are not all that worried about the US commitment, as compared to what the average survey on social media might tell you. Well, this is in part why. If Europe gets invaded, then the continent's economy falls apart overnight, and there goes a whole bunch of buyers of US products. This is the central logic of Western international organization for the last 80 years. And as much as this document tries to claw away from that, we end up back where we started. America first still has to believe in Article 5. It just would like Western European countries to increase defense spending to protect the more vulnerable Eastern European countries. Point number 9. European replacement. Okay, this one is a bit of a mess, and it is another place where US domestic politics starts leaking into the document. It rails against immigration and the prospect of civilizational erasure. After that, there is a point about how, within a few decades at the latest, certain NATO members will become majority non-European, and that this may cause them to question whether they view their place in the world, or their alliance with the United States, in the same way as those who sign the NATO Charter. I am sure that Europeans are looking at those words right now, and are confused about who has been more disruptive to transatlantic relations. Or at least the document says that such an outcome is plausible. But let me make this into a broader point, and I ought to begin by reading you some NATO fertility rates. Italy, 1.26. Spain, 1.3. Poland, 1.32. Greece, 1.41. Portugal, 1.45. Croatia, 1.46. But praise the champagne in France, where the fertility rate is 1.9. Point is, literally every NATO country is below the replacement fertility rate. And that is the replacement rate that we should be talking about, because low fertility rates are a national security issue. You cannot fight a war without warm bodies. It is doubtful that Russia would have invaded Ukraine if Ukraine had an abundance of 18 to 24-year-old males. Immigration is the easiest way to solve the problem. Immigrants tend to be younger. They tend to have more offspring. They tend to be more willing to work the industrial jobs that the national security strategy really wants to come back into Western hands. They tend to bring the innovation that the national security strategy lauds as being one of the major advantages that the United States has over the rest of the world. Again, this is just one of those things that you cannot have both ways. Point number 10. The document is completely unjustified. Yes, every single word of it is unjustified, and I think this comment should have broad bipartisan support. You see, the text does not run flush against the right margin. Biden's 2022 national security strategy was also completely unjustified, but the 2017 one was fully justified by contrast. Personally, I cannot wait to see the angry comments about typographical alignment preferences. And that stupid joke is how we are going to end today's video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.